They said she smiled at things no one else could see, that she would press her small palm against an empty window and listen as if the glass were a throat and something deep inside it hummed back. Now, let us go back to Mississippi, 1846. Her name was Eliza Randolph, 8 by most reckonings, barefoot more often than not, with a braid that smelled of river mud and the lavender oil her nurse kept secret. After the fever took her mother, the house filled with a different silence, the kind that presses like a damp blanket, until the master walked through the yard and, with a voice flat as a ledger, handed the child over to the people who lived in the quarters. What they did not understand was that giving her away had not set her free, and what she learned among them would bend every heart in the house until it broke. If you want to follow stories like this, subscribe to our channel, where we bring the buried corners of memory into light. Now, let us go back to the morning that changed everything. The river was low, and the magnolias sighed as if tired. Silence, silence. The word returned like a small wave, and Eliza stepped down from the carriage with her doll tucked under her arm, its head cracked and one glass eye missing, and nobody in the yard could imagine what she would become. The hush of that day is the first thing people still remember. The hush that settled over the kitchen, over the quarters, and over the master's parlor, and it felt like an answer to some question the house had been carrying for years. In the house there was Master Randolph, a man whose pockets thought like the rest of him, who kept accounts in a neat handwriting and a gaze that measured children like livestock. There was Reverend Amos, who prayed as if time were a ledge to stand on. There was Aunt Betsy, who had known Eliza since her birth. There was Hester, who would watch over the child with hands that trembled the way leaves do before a storm. There was Silas, who carved small wooden toys and hid them in the rafters. There was Cora, who mended shirts with a patience measured in stitches. And there was Liza May, whose laughter sounded like a bell in the night when fear had no voice. They all watched as the master spoke the words that transferred possession into a different register, and even the heavens seemed to pause in the brass heat. The funeral took place 2 days later, a small ceremony in the packed family plot where parson and planter and neighbor stood shoulder to shoulder. And in the shadows beside the oak, the people from the quarters sang a low hymn that did not belong to the ledger or the pulpit, but that held the weather in its throat. She was his child, one neighbor said. He gave her to those below stairs, said another, and their voices scratched like dry leaves. Inside, Eliza sat on a stool made for smaller children, her feet swinging, the broken doll asleep in her lap. "Why am I here?" she asked Hester, not loud, but precise. Hester brushed a strand of hair from Eliza's forehead and smelled of smoke and starch, and she answered with a look that had learned to hold too much. "You are where you are needed," Hester said. "The master thinks you will learn to be quiet." "Will I learn to be quiet like the willow?" Eliza asked. "Who taught the willow to be quiet?" Hester's hands paused, the question like a stone falling into a slow river. "No one taught the willow," she said finally. "It just knows." The people gathered around traded glances. Reverend Amos placed his hand on the child's shoulder and said a benediction that sounded more like a ledger entry than a prayer. The coffin settled into the ground, and the dirt made a small, dull sound, as if the earth itself was sobbing through a mouthful of cotton. There were 5 sensory threads braided through that morning: the smell of wet clay, the taste of ash in the back of the throat, the roughness of sun-warmed clothes, the metallic tang of grief at the tongue, and the cool breath of wind under the oak leaves that carried a faint note of river water. The funeral scene was not simple. It was a negotiation, a rearrangement of priorities. The master's pride, the neighbor's curiosity, the quarter's secret consolation, the child's confusion, and the land's indifference. The master, when he turned away from the grave, said to no one in particular, "Sometimes you must move pieces to win a later game." Aunt Betsy spat once on the path to keep her head clear. Silas carved the number of the years he had watched the house change into the underside of a toy horse, and Cora tucked a thread from her apron into Eliza's sleeve so she would not be forgotten. The transfer that followed was practical, edged with ritual. Hester shook her head and fed Eliza a thin broth that tasted of onion skins, and the child smelled the smoke on Hester's breath and felt a sudden loyalty like a warm stone. In the quarters, the routine took shape with small, careful motions. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, of boiled molasses, of starch, of laundry left too long in a basin, and of the faint and persistent scent of magnolia pollen that would settle into hair and skin. Eliza learned the cadence of the quarters, the names and the rules that were not written but taught by the set of a jaw. She learned to pick cotton with nimble fingers, to hush a crying infant with the crook of her arm, to thread a needle that shone like a thin moon. Hester taught her to recognize the difference between a shout that was an order and a shout that was a warning. "Listen first," Hester would say, "then decide how much of you to give away." The child learned the songs that mattered when people wanted to keep their souls small and hidden. She learned to trace letters in flour with a fingertip and pretend to practice reading while she watched the master's ledger through the crack of a shutter. She watched the parlor from a distance and began to stitch its patterns into her mind, the way some birds tuck shiny things into their nests. The quarters offered safety of a kind and also apprenticeship. Silas taught Eliza to whittle birds from scrap wood. "Carve the space between the beak and the body," he instructed, his voice low and careful. "That is where the sound comes from." They whittled together until Eliza's hands smelled of sap and the small bird's wing felt like a promise. Cora gave her a patchwork apron sewn from the hems of clothes that had been loved into holes, and Eliza would finger the seams when the house was loud and count the stitches like a rosary. The quarters were full of 5 senses at work: the hollow clack of a pot lid finding its nail, the bitter tea of an after-meal, the hard press of sleep on aching limbs, the warmth of a blanket passed along like currency, and the quiet rustle when someone told a story too dangerous to say plainly. In the nights, Hester would tell stories, and one of them became a small map for Eliza, a story about a girl who could coax the river to remember names. "It is only a story," Hester said, but she looked at the river as if it might answer. Those months of integration were layered with small imitations. Eliza began to repeat phrases she had heard in the master's parlor, words turned into mimicry without comprehension. "My property will be kept as my account," she would say at a table in the quarters, and the old women would laugh and then fall quiet, because the imitation carried truth and threat at once. The mimicry worked both ways. She learned to set a table with the master's stiffness, and also to whisper lullabies the way Hester did when storms came up the river. In the corner of her mind, the master's ledger sat like a stone. At night, when the moon traced the rafters, Eliza would touch the cracked eye of her doll and practice small blushes in the dark, learning to fold her face according to passing commands. The first echo of past cruelty came in a moment that smelled of boiled beans and iron. Master Randolph, visiting once, stood in the quarters and watched a child pick a cotton burr. "Do it proper," he said to no one, and then to everyone, and his voice rolled through the space like a wheel. Eliza, who had been watching his hands, copied the way he said it with a slowness that made Hester's fingers stop. "Do it proper," she repeated, and someone laughed a bitter laugh. The phrase stuck like burrs to cloth. It was not long before Eliza began to use language as the master had, not out of agreement, but as a tool. She would climb a tree, and the branches would hold her like arms, and she would call down orders she had learned from the parlor as if they were nets to catch the wind. In those days, a backstory swelled inside her that needed to be told in small breaths. Eliza had been born between the house and the river, a child who first tasted the world as an aftertaste of other people's decisions. Her mother had been gentle,
hands thin from years of washing and smoothing, a woman named May who hummed under her breath as she worked. May's journaling voice appears in scraps, the words of a mother who kept lists rather than stories, lists of chores, lists of teeth, lists of time, and in those lists she tucked a single line about seeing Eliza smile at the reeds. That memory of a mother is a small carved thing, about 850 characters of air and ache. May carried a bowl of souse on market days and would hum a line that had no end. And when Eliza was very small, she would press her ear to May's throat to catch the rhythm of heart and heel. May taught her to count stars by the cracks in the porch and to make a song of the clinking of spoons, until fever took her and left a space that would not mend. The absence of May became both a weight and a compass in Eliza, something she wore like a locket, heavy and warm. For the antagonist, a similar archive collected, a man shaped by ledgers and loss, by small hurts that grew into policy. Master Randolph had been the sort of father who measured affection in minutes, who folded children into his schedule like accounts into a book. He was raised in a house that prized order, a man taught that certainty was a kind of virtue and fear a useful tool. His backstory is shorter but jagged, 650 characters of ledger lines. He learned to tie knots in rope while his own father said little. He learned the sound of a safe closing and treated human voices with similar care. And he believed property extended farther than barns and fields to the people who worked them. He held a piano in the parlor like a scripture, and he could not forgive a melody that did not obey his rhythm. These two histories folded into each other, creating an inevitable collision. As Eliza grew larger in the quarters, her imitation of the master's speech turned into an interrogation of power. She began to test boundaries in quiet ways, returning a borrowed spoon with a small crease cut into the handle so that the owner would see she had been there. She would perform small kindnesses with the same precision she observed the master's charities, and sometimes her decisions healed more than they harmed. Still, the house turned its eyes back toward her. Word spread slowly through the fields and lanes that the master had placed his daughter in the quarters. People whispered and embroidered the story at market stands, at church, and in the hollows of porches. Some said it was a strange mercy, others said it was a new kind of punishment. When the master fell into debt and then into a softer, more brittle temper, he began to spend less time in the parlor and more at the piano, fingers worrying at the keys as if he could pluck order back into being. The return to the house was not announced. It arrived like dusk. The master came down the lane, his boots speaking on gravel, and he brought with him a stranger hard to name, a compulsion that felt like weather. He demanded that Eliza be returned to the main house for instruction. The journey back was a map of difference. The house smelled of lemon polish and wine. The rooms echoed. There were draperies that kept the light in one place like a coin. Eliza stepped across the threshold and felt the house measure her again. "You will sit with me at the piano," the master said. "You will learn your place." His voice had the same flat edges it had always had. The children in the house watched as if observing an experiment. Aunt Betsy, who had been patient in the quarters, moved around like someone who could not sleep. "He is not what he seems," she said to Reverend Amos in the hallway. "He is drowning in his own rules." The return increased the tension in the rooms. The master's instruction was not meant to teach music but compliance. He would press Eliza's hands to the keys and watch the way she flinched, as if the piano could record shame. Eliza learned to press a key and watch the master's face for approval, and when approval did not come, she learned to shape the music into something that sounded like obedience. The piano became a pulse in the house, an instrument that measured the atmosphere. It hummed and then it hummed again, the note recurring like an echo, and in that humming the house found a rhythm between command and fear. Yet the house also began to fissure. The master drank late into the night, and the piano that had once been a decorum turned into a weapon. He would strike keys that spoke like thunder, and on those nights the quarters stayed awake to catch the sound that meant storm. The master's habits broke windows and manners. He would wake the child and demand
perfection, then call her inadequate, with a voice like a ledger slamming shut. The community started to speak in small acts of defiance. Silas carved a bird and left it on a windowsill. Cora sewed a new patch into the student's apron. Reverend Amos began to notice the cracks in the master's piety and pretended not to. These were shifts like tiny earthquakes. Together, they made a tremor strong enough to topple a small, fragile plan. The confrontation came on a night that smelled of rain and old pipe smoke. The master sat at the piano, fingers jittery, and said, "Play the piece as I taught you," with a voice that turned the lamps in their sockets. Eliza sat on the bench and placed her hands on keys that were smooth with varnish, and she remembered the quarters, the river, and the night when Hester had pressed a warm hand to her shoulder and whispered, "Remember, there is more than noise." She thought of May's lists and of Silas's carved birds. "I cannot," she said, not loudly, but with the certainty of someone who had practiced saying small truths. The master laughed, a dry sound. "You cannot, or you will not?" he asked, leaning forward with the intent of a man opening a book. The room folded in. Aunt Betsy, who had been near the doorway, stepped forward. "Let the child be," she said, as if that were a thing that could be arranged. "She has been through enough." The master snapped his eyes toward Aunt Betsy, as if discovering an insect on his sleeve. He reached for the candlestick, not to light, but to detail his authority. "This is my house," he said, "and I will not have my rules questioned." The exchange swelled into accusation and then folded into a salvo of insults. Eliza, who had learned the cadence of the master's voice, suddenly spoke with a clarity that surprised them all. "You measure us with a scale that never balances," she said, and the room stilled at the audacity of a child naming an instrument. The argument escalated, words like shards. "She is my child," the master kept saying, as if repetition could make the world pliant. "You will mind what is proper," he ordered. Hester, who had come to the threshold, said nothing, but her presence was a summons. The argument moved from the piano, to the stairs, to the hall, to the very beams that held the house upright. At one point, the master raised his hand, and the sound that followed was not musical. A single gunshot sounded in the night, sudden and bright, a noise that made the chandeliers shiver. The reaction was a raw, physical thing. Eliza's small body folded inward. Aunt Betsy put a steadying palm on her shoulder. Hester's face had the pride-open look of someone who reads names in bone. Reverend Amos sagged, his sermon undone. The gun did not kill, but it changed the room like a tide. Turning. The master's power had been punctured, not physically, but in its theater. From that night, the house lost the secure certainty it had worn. The master began to fray. He drank more, cursed the piano's notes, and forgot the ledge's little kindnesses. The piano, once a motif of control, became a witness to decline. It hummed at midnight and then stopped, its strings slack like a mouth without speech. The quarters watched the change and reacted in small, precise ways. Silas stopped whittling for a while. Cora took to humming low games into the washing, and Liza May began to leave bread crusts on doorsteps that weren't hers as signals. The master tried to reassert himself with petty edicts, but his edges were softer, like butter left in the sun. Into that softening came a new and darker ritual. The house had always kept a tradition of crossing the river on certain nights to cleanse a grief or to mark a good harvest. But now, in the fissure left by the gunshot, a more ancient impulse rose. Hester, who had kept watch over Eliza, suggested they take the child to the river at dusk,
not to harm, but to unmoor something that worked like a knot in the child's chest. "The river remembers what we forget," Hester told Reverend Amos in the kitchen, her hands folded around a mug the way one folds a small child against cold. They prepared in a way that required the explanation of exact movements. The ritual required 3 small bowls, one for milk, one for river water, and one for a mixture of ash and rosemary. They would press the bowls against the child's palms, coax a small vow, and then walk to the river together. The method was plain and technical, described here so it will be understood. First, they warmed the milk over coals until it steamed and smelled sweet. Then they drew river water in a clay cup and let it rest so silt would settle. Then they burned a small branch of rosemary until it smoked and mixed the ash with a handful of river soil to make a paste. They cleaned the child's hands with a cloth dipped in the warm milk, then pressed the paste into the lines of her palms and asked her to name the things she wanted to leave behind. All of this took little more than an hour, but felt like a lifetime. The description above is not superstitious fluff. It is a procedural account of a folk rite that served as a frame for grief. When the procession walked to the river, their steps were measured, the air heavy with the humid scent of mud and magnolia. Eliza held her doll and smelled its cracked vinyl in the wet air, a small, private grief. There were 5 or 6 distinct sensory moments at the river: the cold slap of water against skin, the taste of metal in the mouth from river sediment,
The bright green of algae under sun, the sound of reeds rubbing like silk, and the luminous glow of a moon half hidden by clouds. The river itself was a character, patient and indifferent, and when they stood at its edge, the surface looked like a black cloth folded and refolded. Hester spoke softly. "Name what you cannot carry," she instructed, and Eliza named fever, and the hush, and the ledger, and slowly the list grew until it felt like a small raft. "Will the river keep them?" Eliza asked. "The river keeps what is told to it," Hester replied, and then bowed her head. There was a moment when the surface of the river flashed silver, and no one could say whether it was moon or some other light underneath. Eliza set the doll in the river and watched it bob. For an instant the doll seemed to float with a smile too wide for the broken face, and a sort of foam gathered like lace around its chin. Some of those present swore later that the water hissed a small single note, a hum that resembled a piano string plucked in a minor key. Then things turned. Eliza stepped forward, and the current took her ankle. Hester shouted and plunged in. The world narrowed to the slap of water and the rapid, unthinking limbs of Hester and the child. Someone called for a rope. Aunt Betsy rooted to the spot, hands white, unable to leave. Silas stripped and dove without a plan and came up coughing. The river kept its will. They pulled Eliza out, shivering, and they wrapped her in blankets. Her small body was cold and luminous, as if the river had polished a child's skin until it gleamed. But the rescue had not returned her wholly to them. In the hours that followed, a strange transformation set in. Eliza slept for a long time and dreamt of the house as a strange echo chamber, and when she awoke, she began to do things no one could fully explain. She would walk through the rooms at night and touch things, and then the objects would yield memories like coins. She would press her palm to the piano, and the keys would sigh in a pattern that made old men cry. She began to say words that sounded like forgiveness and accusation at once, a dialect of loss. The community, witnessing this, divided into those who believed she had been marked by the river, and those who believed the child had learned an art of small manipulations. Reverend Amos said little, but in private he began to write notes in a small book, as if trying to balance what he felt. Hester watched Eliza with a steady intensity. "She is not the master," Hester would say, "nor do I wish her to be, but what she chooses to keep will teach us what we have lost." There were moments of tension that unfolded into almost cinematic beats, each about 500 to 600 characters in length. The first of these happened when Eliza returned to the piano and played a note that matched the master's cough, and his anger flared into violence.
The second when a neighbor, Tom, confronted Hester about supposed improprieties and was silenced by a carved bird left on his porch. The third when Reverend Amos discovered a ledger entry missing and accused Aunt Betsy of mischief. And the fourth when the master, in a drunken fury, tried to strike Eliza and found his arm stopped by an unseen force as if the house itself had repelled him. Each moment was a small story within the larger one, and each left a bruise on memory. People began to tell the story differently. The master's version became tighter, more legal, as if he sought to prove ownership by narrative. Hester's version was full of weather and small intimacies. Silas told the story in carved birds. Cora hummed it into the hems she stitched. Liza May whispered it to children like a warning. The elders, like Aunt Betsy and Reverend Amos, kept a version that was mournful and precise. The house, meanwhile, grew quieter in one sense and louder in another. The piano hummed and then fractured into silence. The master became more brittle, more tobacco-stained in his moods. He tried to reassert discipline through petty cruelties and found his efforts undermined by small rebellions: a pot that would not boil, a gate that refused to latch, a horse that would not be saddled. In the culmination of despair and stubbornness, the master confronted Eliza one evening in the sitting room. The confrontation that followed reads like a trial. "You listen to no one," he said. "You are meant for obedience." "You teach obedience like a lesson in arithmetic," Eliza replied, "but numbers do not hold a heart." Words in the room became like sparks. Aunt Betsy moved between them. Hester stood in the doorway with her hands clenched. Reverend Amos muttered verses that sounded like rope and then ornament. The master lunged toward the piano in a gesture meant to frighten, and Eliza, in a small but decisive movement, placed her fingers on the keys and struck a chord that cracked like lightning across the room. The sound was not pretty. It was a rupture. People remember the exact arrangement of the room and the way the chandeliers trembled. The master fell back, not because of a hand, but because the charge in the room had altered him. He left that night and did not return for some days. The community exhaled and then, carefully, began to make a different sort of life. But the ending for Eliza was not a simple salvation. There was a ritual of parting at the river which, in the retelling, became both literal and symbolic, an offering to the flow of things that cannot be held. On a morning heavy with fog, Eliza walked to the river again, accompanied.
She walked with measured steps. The river took, or perhaps it offered, a small thing back. In the final sequence, the water gathered around Eliza like a shawl. She did not scream. She sang a single low note that matched the hum of the piano, and then she let the quiet take her. Those who stood on the bank reported different things. Some said they saw a bright light under the water. Some said that after she submerged, small fish swam in circles like coins. Some said they heard the master's piano somewhere in the distance, and that it sounded less like accusation and more like something trying to be forgiven. The death, when it was declared, became myth and wound itself around the community like ivy. They buried the old doll near the tree by the quarters and placed a stone with no inscription. The ritual that ended in loss had also ended something harsher. People wept and then found small habits shifting. Aunt Betsy started teachings for children that were not about obedience. Reverend Amos took up a different kind of prayer, one that contained questions. Silas whittled birds that he left in odd places as tokens. Cora mended shirts with extra care under the collar, as if to stitch tenderness into places that had once been empty. The house slowly decayed. The master's ledger was closed and then lost. The piano strings broke and never replaced, and vines claimed the porch. In the months after the river, the community marked time in 3 clear moments as memory did its work. After 1 month, the air tasted of salt, and the routine had to be reassembled. There were small acts of mourning, a table set for a person who no longer came, a patch of ground tilled in a way that made new rows. People said prayers at dusk and passed bread in silence. Hester sat often by the river and washed clothes with the same motion as before, but she sang different songs.
Her grief was present like a permanent bruise, and her hands moved with both skill and tremor. The community stitched a small banner of remembrance and hung it near the quarters. After 3 months, customs had shifted more deeply. Reverend Amos announced a small change at the church, a dedication to those who had no voice. Aunt Betsy began teaching a class of girls how to read letters from their own making, as if literacy were a weapon of tenderness. The field where Eliza had once played became a plot where children learned to plant things that would bear fruit in summer. Silas organized small gatherings where stories could be told without fear. The master's hold had loosened. His authority was now a rumor. After 6 months, the house had become poorer in shape and richer in story. The piano sat in the parlor,
Keys that a rash of visits had destituted, and yet when the wind moved through broken windows, it sometimes made chords that sounded like laughter. The river had a bank lined with small offerings, coins, and carved birds. People came from neighboring farms to hear about Eliza, and the story grew wings. It became a caution and a hymn, a thing that taught children to watch for the small hums of injustice and to respond. The land itself seemed to shift. The soil near the river was richer, and the magnolia trees shed their blossoms in patterns that people read as signs. The epilogue of the place remained ambiguous, a testament to how memory shuffles fact and meaning. In the years that followed, the tale of the master who gave his daughter to the people below stairs and what she became was told as a parable of brittle power and of what happens when innocence walks through other people's pain and learns to name it. Some said the child had been a witch of mercy. Others said she had been a mirror, and when a house sees itself in a mirror, it sometimes breaks. The legacy of Eliza settled into a few small rituals. Each year, on the morning the master left for good, people from nearby would leave a simple bouquet of magnolia and a carved bird at the quarter stump. Children were told to listen to the river and to name the things they could not carry. And the piano, when anyone dared to bring it back to life, would never be tuned in the same way again. If this story touched you and you have memories like it in your family, please tell them in the comments below. We want to build a place where people can begin with a phrase and feel safe to share. Start your comment with the words, "in my town," and then tell us a single sentence that keeps returning to your mind. Your small memory can help others recall what was once silenced. We read every comment and we treat these stories like careful things, because history is not only in books, but also in the mouths of those who remember. Your voice helps shape the way we remember together. If you would like to hear more about forgotten river rituals, broken pianos, or children who taught houses new music, subscribe to our channel. We will bring the documents, interview mock historians, and read the old letters that stitch this world together. The final image we are left with is simple and also not simple. Eliza closed her eyes at the river, and the water continued to speak. The house darkened, the piano lost its temper, and the community changed in ways both small and irreversible. The lesson that lingers is not a tidy moral, but a watchword. Cruelty travels through silence, but silence can be answered if someone chooses to speak, or to name, or to leave a carved bird. Bird on a windowsill. If you want to hear another story where a small act breaks a larger habit, subscribe and stay with us. Remember the hush that became a song? Remember the child who listened, and the river that kept her name. The river keeps what is told to it, and sometimes the telling is the only mercy we can give.